The Tonight Show was never just a television program. It was a ritual. Every night for 3 decades, Americans wound down their days by settling into their couches, tuning into NBC and letting Johnny Carson guide them through 30 minutes of polished, predictable comfort. Carson understood something fundamental about late-night television that no one before or since has quite replicated. The audience didn't come looking for chaos. They came looking for calm. They wanted to laugh, feel entertained, and drift toward sleep with a smile on their face. Carson gave them exactly that, night after night, with a precision that bordered on the surgical. His desk, his monologue, his gentle interviewing style, the way he could coax a story out of a nervous guest, with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. It was all engineered to create an atmosphere of effortless ease. But here is the thing about building a kingdom this perfectly controlled. You are also building the most dramatic stage in the world for the rare moment when everything falls apart. And fall apart it did, not often, not regularly, but when it happened, when a guest shattered the careful illusion Carson had spent years constructing, the result was something television almost never delivers by accident. Genuine, unscripted, white-knuckle surprise. These were not planned bits. These were not rehearsed comedy segments dressed up to look spontaneous. These were real human beings crossing lines that Carson had spent his entire career keeping firmly in place. And the results were so uncomfortable, so fascinating, and so completely unlike anything else you would ever see on that couch that they burned themselves into television history permanently. What follows is the story of 7 of those moments. 7 guests who walked onto the most controlled stage in American television and turned The Tonight Show into something it was never meant to be. Carson spent his whole life keeping chaos at bay. These are the nights. It stormed through the door, anyway. Madonna walked onto that stage in 1987 like she owned the room, and in a very real sense, she did. By that point, she was already one of the most talked about women in America, riding the momentum of her Who's That Girl tour, and a reputation that was rapidly becoming synonymous with provocation. But there is a difference between provoking people on your own concert stage, where you have complete creative control, and provoking someone on their own television show, where the rules belong to someone else entirely. Madonna apparently did not care about that difference. She arrived wearing something far more appropriate for one of her own concerts than for late-night network television. Black lace, fishnet stockings, and an energy that immediately told everyone in the studio this was not going to be a normal interview. Carson's producers had expected playful. What they got was a woman who had decided to use The Tonight Show as her personal stage and dared anyone to stop her. From the very first exchange, Madonna seized control in a way Carson almost never allowed. She flirted aggressively, made comments that pushed well past what NBC's standards department was comfortable with, and when Carson tried his usual technique of gentle redirection, Madonna responded by pushing harder instead of pulling back. Carson was not a man who flustered easily. 30 years of live television had given him nerves of steel and a poker face that could rival any professional gambler. But Madonna cracked that face multiple times. She made references that had censors hovering over the delay button, and Carson found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of being the person trying to tone things down, a role he had spent his entire career avoiding. The audience split almost perfectly along generational lines. Younger viewers loved watching someone challenge the establishment. Older viewers were shocked, but nobody disputed that Madonna had gotten exactly what she came for. She had created a moment, amplified her own image, and used Carson's platform in a way no amount of traditional promotion could have accomplished. The cost, however, was permanent. Carson never invited her back. Madonna became one of the very few major stars of the decade quietly shut out of The Tonight Show, not for being boring, but for being too much. Don Rickles was not supposed to be a problem. He was one of Carson's closest friends, one of the most beloved regular guests in Tonight Show history, and a comedian whose entire act was built around playful insults that Carson genuinely enjoyed absorbing on camera. Their relationship was one of the warmest and most authentic on the show, which is exactly why what Rickles did in 1976 was so shocking. It started the night before, when Carson stepped off set briefly and Rickles, filming his sitcom on a nearby NBC stage, sat down in Carson's chair and broke his treasured cigarette box, a prized gift from NBC that had been part of the desk set up for years. The next day, Carson brought the broken box out and playfully complained about what had happened. It was supposed to be a lighthearted anecdote. What Carson did not know was that Rickles was watching from backstage, and Rickles, in full Navy costume from his sitcom, burst onto the set without warning, without permission, and without any regard for the segment Carson was in the middle of conducting. For the next several minutes, The Tonight Show became something it had never been before. Rickles took over completely. He grabbed Carson's desk, shouted across the set, delivered insults that went well beyond his usual routine, and essentially held the entire production hostage, while millions watched in a mixture of delight and growing unease. At first, it was funny. The surprise, the audacity, the image of Rickles in costume charging onto national television uninvited, it had undeniable comedic energy. But as the minutes went on, something shifted. The laughter became less certain. Carson kept smiling, kept playing along, but his expression told a different story. This was not a bit. This was Rickles genuinely taking over Carson's show, and Carson was trying to figure out in real time how to get it back. Backstage staff reported Carson was genuinely angry afterward. He was famously protective of The Tonight Show's format, and even with his closest friends there were boundaries. Rickles had demolished several of them simultaneously on live television. The two men remained friends, but Carson was noticeably cooler toward Rickles for months afterward. A subtle but unmistakable signal that some lines, once crossed, leave marks that take a long time to fade. Oliver Reed arrived at NBC in 1975 to promote his film Royal Flash, and from the moment he walked onto the set, it was clear something had gone very wrong before he ever sat down. Reed was already known for volatile behavior and an enthusiastic relationship with alcohol. But reputation is one thing. Watching it play out in real time on America's most watched late-night show is something else entirely. Reed's condition that evening was not subtle. His walk was unsteady, his eyes unfocused, and according to crew members, the smell of alcohol was strong enough to detect from several feet away. Carson noticed immediately. He was far too experienced to miss the signs, and he spent the opening moments trying to assess exactly how bad the situation was and how quickly he needed to end it gracefully. The answer was that there was no graceful way out. Reed's responses veered wildly between charming and belligerent. One moment he would attempt something resembling wit, the next he would interrupt Carson mid-sentence or launch into rambling stories with no beginning, middle, or end. Carson tried every tool available. Gentle redirection, humor, changing the subject entirely. None of it worked. Reed was not listening. The audience's reaction told the story. Early on there were nervous laughs, the uncertain kind that people produce when they cannot tell whether they are watching a comedy bit or something genuinely uncomfortable. As the interview continued, those laughs faded into silence. By the time Carson finally cut the segment short, a move he rarely made, the studio had fallen into the kind of quiet that only happens when an audience collectively wishes they were not watching what they are watching. For Reed, the damage was immediate and lasting. He had come hoping to leverage British film success into Hollywood stardom. Instead, he had handed every studio executive in the country videotaped evidence of exactly why casting him might be a terrible idea. Truman Capote was one of the most brilliant writers of the 20th century. In cold blood had redefined nonfiction. Breakfast at Tiffany's had made him a cultural icon. His early Tonight Show appearances had been everything you could hope for when a literary genius sits beside a host who genuinely respected literature, sharp, funny, intellectually alive. By 1980, that version of Capote was largely gone. The substance abuse that had been quietly consuming him for years had progressed to a point that could no longer be hidden. And when he appeared on Carson's show, the contrast between who he had been and who he had become was painfully visible. His speech was slurred from the moment he opened his mouth. His thoughts wandered so far from any coherent path that Carson, who had spent decades guiding conversations, found himself unable to steer this one anywhere. Carson genuinely admired Capote. He kept trying, kept asking questions, kept offering conversational lifelines, hoping the brilliant mind he knew was in there would surface. It never did. Capote made inappropriate comments that pushed past the show's standards. Carson redirected. Capote circled back. Carson tried again. Capote ignored him entirely and continued down whatever path his fragmented mind had chosen. The audience watched in something close to collective sympathy. These were people who knew Capote's work, who remembered the razor-sharp observer he had once been. Watching him struggle to complete a single coherent thought was not entertaining in the way other difficult moments had been. It was simply sad. Carson never invited him back. A telling decision from a host who generally gave troubled guests second chances, and one that revealed just how deeply uncomfortable that appearance had been for everyone involved. Shelley Winters was not a guest who needed to be managed so much as contained. Academy Award winner, legendary actress, and a personality so outsized that even Carson sometimes found himself on the back foot during her appearances. Winters had been on The Tonight Show many times, and Carson had developed a general strategy for dealing with her energy. Let her run, keep the guardrails loosely in place, and trust that her natural charisma would keep things entertaining. But one night, the guardrails were not enough. It started as a standard panel conversation. Winters was on the couch alongside another well-known actress when something was said, a comment Winters perceived as a slight, and whatever equilibrium Carson had been maintaining evaporated instantly. Winters stood up. She pointed fingers. She raised her voice to a volume genuinely startling in The Tonight Show's intimate atmosphere. And then she began talking, not about the comment that set her off, but about everything. The treatment of women in Hollywood, the way aging actresses were discarded, the accumulated grievances of a long career spent fighting for respect in an industry that had not always given it freely. Carson tried to bring things back under control. He used humor. He tried gentle interruption. Nothing worked. Winters was not interested in being managed. She wanted to be heard, and she was going to make sure that happened regardless of whether it fit the format or the mood. Staff members watching from behind the cameras reported that Carson's irritation was visible, in a way it rarely was on air. He shuffled his papers constantly and glanced at Ed McMahon repeatedly. The tales that people who knew him recognized as genuine frustration rather than the playful kind he performed for the audience. Eventually, Carson called for a commercial break, his ultimate tool for stopping a segment beyond rescue. When the show returned, the atmosphere had shifted but never fully recovered. What made the incident remarkable, though, was Carson's response afterward. He did not ban Winters. He simply asked producers to space out her next appearance a little further. Carson's quiet way of giving everyone time to recover before trying again. Buddy Hackett was supposed to be one of Carson's easiest guests, a natural storyteller with an infectious laugh and an instinct for comedy that had made him a Tonight Show favorite for years. When Hackett sat down, Carson barely needed to do anything. A single question, and Hackett would launch into one of his animated tales that kept everyone laughing for minutes. It was one of the most reliable dynamics on the show. Except on this particular night in the mid-70s, it did not go that way. Hackett started normally enough, settled into the chair, and began what seemed like another trademark story. But the story took a turn, and then another. And before long, it was not a story anymore. It was something closer to a confession, a raw, increasingly bitter account of people in Hollywood that Hackett felt had wronged him. Producers he considered dishonest. Executives he believed had cheated him. Names, specific names, delivered with a venom completely at odds with the warm, comedic persona the audience had come to love. The laughter that normally accompanied a Hackett appearance faded gradually, then disappeared entirely, replaced by silence that only happens when an audience realizes they are no longer watching entertainment, but watching someone air grievances that were never meant for a national stage. Carson tried to redirect multiple times. Hackett was not interested. He had something to say, and he was going to say it regardless of whether it fit the show or the moment. Carson eventually went to commercial early and smoothly transitioned to something else when they returned, effectively ending the appearance without making it more awkward than it already was. Backstage, Carson was reportedly more concerned than angry. He could see something was genuinely bothering Hackett, something real and personal, that had spilled out in a way that probably had not been fully planned. Carson asked his producer to check in on Hackett before booking him again. A small gesture that revealed something important about how he viewed his guests. They were not just television assets. They were people. And sometimes people were not okay. Red Fox walked off The Tonight Show in 1975 after less than 2 minutes on air. And the entire incident was so fast, so sudden, and so completely without warning that it left Carson sitting alone on his own set, with an expression that even seasoned NBC employees had rarely seen. Fox was already a television icon thanks to Sanford and Son, and his appearance was supposed to be a straightforward promotional visit. Simple, controlled, predictable. Fox had one problem. He was a heavy smoker who had assumed, reasonably enough, given the era, that smoking during the appearance would be perfectly fine. It was not fine. NBC had tightened its policies on smoking during broadcasts, and when Fox sat down and asked Carson if he could light up, the answer was no. Carson delivered the news casually, the way you might tell someone the coffee had run out. He assumed Fox would shrug and move on. Fox did not shrug. His entire demeanor changed in the space of a single breath. He went from relaxed to visibly agitated, insisting he could not do this without a cigarette. Carson initially assumed this was a bit. Comedians played with him all the time, pushed back on questions, created little moments of tension that everyone understood were part of the performance. Carson laughed and tried to keep things moving. Fox was not performing. He stood up, told Carson that if he could not smoke, then he could not do this, and walked off the stage. Not dramatically. Not with a big speech. He simply stood up, said what he had to say, and left. Carson was alone at his desk, in front of a studio full of people and a national television audience, processing what had just happened. He recovered with a quip and moved on, because he was Carson, and that was what Carson did. But backstage the mood was genuine bewilderment. In 30 years of hosting, Carson had seen guests stumble, embarrass themselves, cross lines in every conceivable way. He had not often seen a guest simply leave. Not that fast, not over something that simple. Fox's team smoothed things over quickly, and Carson never made a big deal of it publicly. But the relationship carried a quiet tension in every subsequent encounter. A shared memory of the night, when the most controlled environment in American television collapsed not because of scandal or substance abuse or calculated provocation, but because a man wanted a cigarette and could not have one. Carson spent 30 years building The Tonight Show into something that felt effortless but was, in reality, one of the most carefully engineered programs in television history. Every element was considered. Every guest was vetted. Every segment was structured to deliver a specific kind of experience, entertaining, comfortable, reliably enjoyable. And for the vast majority of those 30 years, it worked exactly as intended. But the moments that people remember, the ones that have survived decades while thousands of other interviews have been completely forgotten, are almost never the smooth ones. They are the ones where the machinery broke down. Madonna, who decided Carson's show was hers to conquer. Rickles, who burst through the backstage door and took over the broadcast. Oliver Reed, who arrived too far gone to give Carson anything to work with. Truman Capote, whose brilliant mind had been consumed by demons no amount of gentle questioning could reach. Shelley Winters, who turned a panel discussion into a one-woman war. Buddy Hackett, who used a comedy slot to settle scores that had nothing to do with comedy. And Red Fox, who walked off after 2 minutes because the one thing he needed was not available. What connects all 7 of these moments is not the specific nature of the disruption. Each one was completely different. What connects them is what they revealed about the man behind the desk. Carson's response to every single one of these incidents was the same at its core. He tried to protect the guest. He tried to protect the show. He tried to restore order without making anything worse. He never once used a guest's worst moment to make himself look better by comparison. In an era when hosts might have leaned into the chaos or turned someone else's breakdown into their own highlight reel, Carson did the opposite. He absorbed the disruption, contained it, and moved on, because that was what The Tonight Show was. Not a place for spectacle. A place where America came to feel comfortable before sleep. Carson built that place with extraordinary care over 30 years. And on the rare nights when it cracked open and let the chaos in, what you saw was not a television show falling apart. It was the most controlled man in American television revealing, for just a moment, that even he could not always hold the line.